Hello, everyone. Hello. Thank you all for being here today. My name is Margie Cook. I'm part of the team that brings you live from NYPL, and thanks again to everyone here right now and also watching on the live stream. Tonight, we are thrilled to welcome Kevin Nguyen, hailed as one of the most exciting new voices in fiction, in conversation with writer and cultural critic Chris Gayomali, whose work has appeared in GQ, The Atlantic, and The Verge. Together, they'll be here discussing Kevin's latest novel, My Documents. So you can find their full bios in your printed programs or on the event listing on our website. And to tell you more about the novel, My Documents follows four Vietnamese cousins whose lives are upended after a terrorist attack triggers a government crackdown, leading to the mass internment of Vietnamese-American citizens. Drawing from the history of Japanese internment, the Vietnam War, and more recent immigrant detention, Nguyen imagines a near future America that feels perhaps more plausible than anyone might like. This month happens also to be Asian American, Native Hawaiian, and Pacific Islander Month. The library is proud to celebrate, and I hope you will continue to join us in exploring a variety of special programs and events, just like this one, that highlights the rich histories, cultures, and contributions of the AA and HPI communities. You can visit the library website for more details and, more on the schedule. Kevin's book is available here for purchase in this room and through our online shop for those attending virtually. And however you choose to buy it, we encourage you to. If you're able, all proceeds go to support the library. And for those of you in person, there will be a book signing after the event. And for our online audience, we'll drop a purchase link in the chat if we haven't already. And of course, if you have a New York Public Library card, which I assume you all do, you can borrow the book for free. So before we continue, I'd love to tell you about a few of our upcoming events. On May 28th, we have former U.S. Secretary of Education under President Obama, John B. King Jr. He will join us to share his deeply personal love letter to the teachers in our lives, and he will be in conversation with Lizette Nieves, president of the Fund for the City of New York. On June 10th, we're hosting a free screening of The Life of Chuck, the new film by director Mike Flanagan, starring Tom Hiddleston, and adapted from a short story by Stephen King. And on Friday the 13th, don't miss our next Library After Hours Pride Edition, featuring special hours access to the Rosemain Reading Room and other venues inside the library, live music, rare collections, 16mm films, and a dance party to cap off the night. So we hope you'll join us for those and more. One last thing, when you entered the auditorium, you should have received an index card. Please use that card to write down any questions you might have. A staff member will come around to collect them during the program. Live from NYPL is made possible by the continuing generosity of Celeste Bartos, Manaz Isfahani Bartos, and Adam Bartos, and of course by all of you, our wonderful supporters and friends near and far. Thank you for that support, and thank you again for being here. And now please join me in welcoming Kevin and Chris.
Hello. Hello.
Happy AAPI month, Chris.
Happy AAPI month, Kevin. We did it. I'm going to pretend that I'm not looking at my phone for the questions and that I'm hiding it behind this thing, but just pretend that I actually wrote everything down. I don't know how much you guys know about us, but we both worked at GQ, and do you remember what year
I started in 2016, and I think you started in like 1982.
Yeah. Yeah, we overlapped and caught like the tail end of the golden era of magazine making. Pretty soon within starting, I remember we got called into some sort of a ideas retreat, and that was pretty fun.
Yeah, that was like, I think in the first month they were just like, oh, like the retreat is like gonna be at Block Island on Rhode Island, or off the coast of Rhode Island. And I was like, that's so cool, like an editorial retreat. And like the person told me, was like, well, last year was in Tulum. And then the year after that, after Block Island, there were like no more retreats.
Yeah.
So, but I got one.
Yeah, there's nothing like an ideation session like on the beach, like with sand in your toes, while your editor-in-chief is like, should we put Obama in the cover? And we're like, yeah, sure, that sounds like a good idea. Like, I don't know. So I wanted to talk to you about this, amazing novel that you've written. And I hate giving you compliments, so that was really hard for me to say. But, it's about internment. Why are you giving the government good ideas?
Well, arguably, the government already had that idea.
So what sort of drew you to the idea of using internment as a sort of backdrop for storytelling? Because, you could kind of see it lets you talk about all these big ideas around class and sort of, privilege and all those sort of like big ideas that you can sort of launder through the internment camp. So what sort of like piqued your interest in this in the first place?
Yeah, I guess I kind of think a lot about how Asian Americans are situated in terms of our privileges or lack thereof. And it's kind of funny because even like Asian Americans, we don't understand or know a lot of our own history.
Right.
And I'm guilty of that too. I did not learn about Japanese incarceration until I got to college.
Oh, totally.
And I grew up on the East Coast. I think you do learn about it a little bit if you grew up in California.
We absolutely did not, but continue.
Well, you also didn't go to class, so
Yeah.
you probably just missed it. But I remember I grew up in Massachusetts, and we did like an entire year on the Holocaust, and like Japanese American internment like did not come up one single time,
Right.
And I don't think it has to be like the focus of a year of education, but like one day would be nice. And I even remember too, like in my 20th century American history class, our unit on the Vietnam War was like 2 days.
Oh, wow.
And so just like it makes you think about like, okay, like what history like should we know and what are we taught? And ever since college, and I had this amazing professor, Tamika Nomura, who was Japanese American, and she had I think her grandfather was interned. And so, part of it was like we did like a whole unit of literature from incarceration, and I don't know. So I've been reading about it off and on ever since college. So for like 15 years by this point, and it just like always surprised me like still how few people knew that history.
Right.
And originally I was going to write a book that was just like a historical novel set in a camp, and I don't know, Julia Tsuka exists, and she's like written these great books about that, and so I kind of like wanted to imagine something else, and I don't think like there's a moral universe in this novel, but a lot of the setup of it is like about these like Vietnamese kids. They're like in their late teens, early 20s, and they like have no knowledge of this history, and then kind of the U.S. like thrusts this same experience upon them.
One thing that struck me about, a lot of other AAPI authors, a lot of the work is like kind of sad and rooted in trauma in a real way, but the way you use the camps in the book, I should ask first, like how many of you guys have read the book already? Oh, that's great. Awesome.
It's not bad, yeah.
Sick. But it's rooted in like a real sense of joy. Like they're playing football, they're like bartering with like USB drives that have like illegal media like on it and stuff like that. I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about the intention of wanting to depict that in this book and how you chose to go about it.
Yeah, that's a great question. There's like a couple levels of that. Like the super broad one is that I just personally enjoy art that is funny or has a sense of humor. And then I guess two, it's funny, like even a lot of the writing still about Japanese American incarceration, the Vietnam War, migrant detention, it's just like, it's quite political. It's all about how awful the thing is. And I think those like realities are true, but if you actually like read diaries or things that came out of Japanese American incarceration in particular, it's like, yeah, like there was kind of this like existential dread that like loomed over the various camps. But at the same time, like people still like had lives. They were there for 3 years. They were making art. They were telling stories, like they were writing poetry. There were camp newspapers. There were sort of like football leagues and baseball leagues, like you mentioned. And then so when I thought about like this imagination of it that I wanted to portray, I thought about that gap. And I think it's like great for narrative tension, but like you would arrive in a camp and you would just like feel terrible about like the way your life had gone and you like the lack of control you had over it. And then you would also just like miss the internet a lot. You know, like you would just like be annoyed that you can just like play any song on your phone whenever you wanted. You'd be annoyed that you like didn't have a phone. I like the idea that like the characters in the book are like young people. So on one hand, they kind of acknowledge like the larger things, but I think that age in life where you're like late teens, early 20s, like you just think about yourself a lot and how like annoying things are. And I thought that gap between like sort of the greater existential challenges that they face and like the day-to-day petty things would, well, I thought it'd be really funny, but I actually think it like is also narratively quite propulsive.
Yeah, one of the funnier aspects of like reading a book that your friend wrote and hearing all their bad jokes over the years is you know, at the camp they're like karaokeing or like doing a cappella groups of Linkin Park songs, and I was like, when I come across that, I'm like, oh damn, Kevin, like man. So you know, your first novel, you wrote New Waves mostly on your phone, and we're like, oh crap, I should maybe put this all together and maybe I have a novel here. How did you start writing My Documents?
Yeah, like the lore of my first book is that I used to just do this thing when I was much younger. I was like, I would be on the subway, it'd be crowded, and if I didn't have space to like open a book and read, I would just like write things in my phone, and I would just write things like imagine dialogue, things that happen at work, like kind of these like weird oblique concepts for sci-fi stories, and then that like the note in the Apple Notes app got so big that it like crashed the app. And I could still open it on my computer, and then I copy and pasted it into a Google Doc, and the Google Doc was like 20,000 words long, and I was just like, I have wasted so much time like in this thing. But then I like kind of reread it all, and then I saw sort of a through line there, and kind of figuring out that through line was actually like the motivating idea behind New Waves. So in a weird way, like the first book was kind of happenstance. Like I didn't set out to write a book. I didn't think I could finish a book. Like that was the goal. And then I finished it, and I was like, well, no one will like buy or read this. And I don't know, I was lucky, and like those things fell into place. So this is the thing, book 2, it's like you've like proven to yourself that you can do it. So you're just like, this is gonna be so much easier the second time around. And I was like,
man.
wrong. And like all the things that I did for the first book, like I used to write in the morning. Actually, okay, I can tell you guys this. I used to write in the morning, and people are just like, oh, you must have to like wake up so early. And I'd have to be like, nah, man, I work at GQ. Like we get to the office at like 10:30, you know? It's like a couple solid hours in the morning, and then I like take a shower. But yeah, for this book, it was so much harder because I had more intention. I wanted to do something with more point of view characters. I kind of wanted a very different, more propulsive plot. And yeah, I did try to write a lot of it on my phone, and it just like immediately did not work. So I don't know. I had to like really it is thematically a similar novel, I think, but the mechanics of it are very different, and that was a fun new challenge that I was excited about, but it really made like writing this book quite difficult. And we were in the pandemic.
Right. Oh, there you go. Yeah. A process question. How many good words can you write in a day?
That's a tricky question because if I'm like in the zone, I can write 1,000 words in the course of a few hours, and I'm really happy with that. The thing is, like, I probably write twice as much for a book than I need, at least telling from these 2 books. And then, yeah, I throw away like half. So I guess maybe the answer is then like technically 500. Even though like I'll write 1,000 words and then I'll wake up the next day and I'm like, that is a nonsense chapter.
Yeah.
Chapter. And then
I top out at 200, so you've got me like way beat over there. This is something I've always wanted to ask you, and I'm like so interested in this with other writers. Like, I've edited a couple pieces you've written, you've edited me a couple times, so we kind of like see each other at our most vulnerable in a lot of ways. Who are the writers early on in your sort of like writing career that sort of you were trying to mimic, and like, you know, as you were developing your style as a writer?
Ooh, that's tough. It's interesting because, at least in fiction, I don't have clear-cut, like, have a lot of heroes, but I actually write books that are very different than them. Like,
Right.
I love Ishiguro, and like my books are nothing. My books are not nearly as patient as a Kazuo Ishiguro book. But I think in journalism, and I actually think I write my novels a lot. They read a lot like magazine journalism in the sense that like I'm not like a long sentences person. I would actually argue I'm not like a beautiful sentences person. And I like reading that stuff, but I actually don't always know if that's in service of the book. So yeah, I think there are a lot of like magazine writers that I really look up to, like like obviously like John Jeremiah Sullivan was a big reason I wanted to work at GQ. Yeah, who else? Oh, like a lot of the early like Elizabeth Gilbert pieces, also from GQ. So yeah.
Ah, 2 white people, interesting. Huh. On
Listen, in
AAPI
magazines, you don't have a lot of options. Happy AAPI month.
I don't know if you all know this, but some of the pieces that Kevin has edited have been nominated for Pulitzers, which is like, the most amazing prize that you can sort of get in this industry. So he's an amazing editor too as a writer, which is a big rarity, I sort of feel like, in our field. How has sort of being an editor changed how you've decided to approach writing, if at all?
Really good question. It's funny when you're an editor, you just like spend all day dealing with writers, and you're just like, writers are monsters. Like, why can't they just like do what they're asked? Why do they complain about everything? Like, does a deadline mean anything to them? And then you become, my editor is here. Yeah, okay. Well, then you become a writer yourself, and you just become like the monster that you complained about all the time. I like turn in everything late. I just like don't answer emails. So all to say, I actually don't think it should have influenced the way I write, and then did not.
Right. Are you like a very like critical reviser when you're going through what you wrote?
Yeah, I do think that's one thing that I'm good at, in the sense like I'm really good at like puking a draft on the page. Like, I know people that like they need each sentence to be perfect before they move on, and I'm just not that person. Like, I just like have to like let it sprawl. Yeah, actually, the first draft of this book that I sent my agent, and she's my first reader on everything, was about 100,000 words long, which is pretty long. It's like maybe closer to 400 pages. And she was like, "You got to cut like 20,000 words." But she also like wanted me to like sort of bring a little more depth to certain parts of it. So the next version I turned into her was 130,000 words. And she was like, "That's the opposite of what I asked you to do." And she was right. And then eventually, I think like, yeah, after my agent and my editor, like we got through it. I think the version that exists now is like somewhere in the 80s, like a pretty reasonable novel length. But yeah, there's like 50,000 words of this book that are on the cutting room floor, and it's like, thank God they're there,
So one of the most popular posts that Kevin wrote at GQ was a silly little blog post called "How to Read 3 Books in a Week," which was like such a flex in a lot of ways. Is that still the case?
No, I definitely don't read as much anymore. I think the post was just like how to read a book a week. But it's sort of funny. Like I've written like quite a few things like throughout my career in journalism, and like the one I get the most random emails about is that one.
What do they say?
I've definitely gotten ones that just like called me a liar, which is funny because it is truly not crazy to read one book a week if you put your mind to it. It's like if it takes you like 4 to 8 hours a week to read a book, that's like an hour a day. Like it's not that crazy to like set aside that time if you really want. It's like not impossible.
Yeah.
But no, they're mostly like kind of. It's funny because at GQ I mostly worked on like profiles and features and kind of like the longer things, and I would say like the thing that GQ does really well, among other things, it does service journalism really well, it does packages really well. I was always like really bad at that stuff. Chris is really good at it. Well, Chris is kind of good at all the things in GQ, but I was never good at that thing. And yeah, so it was like the one time I tried service journalism, and like it kind of like hit, and I really respected the thing so much more after having to do it myself.
Well, speaking of like, the internet sort of dictating and ruining our brains in a lot of ways, there was one throwaway line in the book where, so there's like this fake BuzzFeed startup in the book called Top Story, and like one of the editors says to another editor that grief plays really well on Facebook in talking about the victims of the camp. I wonder if you could like talk a little bit about that and like your experience working in SEO journalism and like how that sort of came to be.
Yeah. So there is like a journalism like plot line in the book. So basically, like there are 4 siblings. 2 are in camp and 2 are outside. And the engine of the book, I'm talking like a TV writer now, is that like one of the sisters in camp is able to communicate with the sister outside of camp, or they're able to communicate with each other. And the sister outside of camp is a journalist, and she works at like a BuzzFeed knockoff. Actually, in an early draft, it was literally called BuzzFeed. But this was like 2018 when people thought like BuzzFeed was the future of like sustainable digital journalism. And then like by the time like 2022 rolled around and we're like editing this book, like it's like no longer the case.
Oh, I know.
So anyway, so yeah, like the older sister Ursula works at BuzzFeed / I call it Top Story. And she basically like takes everything that her sister in camp tells her about camp and then like starts reporting on camp that way. And so it just made me think a lot about like the dynamics of journalism. I believe like quite earnestly in the project of journalism in a free press, but I also, and I say this without better like solutions to it, like there is a weird power imbalance between a journalist and a source. And I feel that quite strongly, like at my day job, I work at the Verge, where like we work on investigative features, and I don't know, I still don't quite know how to reckon with that, because on some level, like I think a lot of journalists, many journalists, like do incredible work. They really put themselves out there. It can often be a thankless job. At the same time, like there are certain, like if you're a power-seeking person, like there are ways you can really exploit that position. So that was kind of a thing that I've seen it in newsrooms. But yeah, I kind of wanted to explore the interiority of that as a character in the book.
One thing that I found like hard to believe about the internment camps was that you could get this many people to play organized football in any sort of capacity. And something that in the book that I wanted to bring up that's not controversial at all is dogfighting. And particularly that you're using this to sort of launder an argument in defense of Michael Vick and the book. Just kidding. But how did that start off? Was that like one of your notes that you were jotting down on the train? Like, where did this sort of like there was like an extended like 4-page section on it that I thought was really funny and smart.
There were actually. So the one thing that like I learned about reading about Japanese-American incarceration is baseball leagues were really big, and they were really organized and they're really good. And then later, it's actually one of the book recommendations that I submitted to the NYPL in the brochure. It's for Bradford Pearson's The Eagles of Heart Mountain, and I had already had this whole football plot line in the book when I was writing it, but this book came out. Yeah, I guess in the middle of the pandemic, and Eagles of Heart Mountain is about this like extremely talented football team at Heart Mountain, which is one of the internment camps in Wyoming. So I already had like it in the book, and then like suddenly like someone has written an entire book of like historical research about the thing, and I was like, Yahtzee,
Yeah. This is all I needed to like get
thank
football
you,
at the ground.
Brad. And so that like. That does exist. That's like a thing I really pulled from the reality of incarceration for. Specific to the Michael Vick stuff, it actually like was one of the things that was much longer in the earlier draft. Did you ever read Nickel Boys?
I did.
The Colson Whitehead book.
Yeah.
There's just like this weird chapter in the middle of it that is just like a prolonged boxing chapter about a completely different character that's not. I'm trying to remember Elwood. There's 2 main characters in Nickel Boys, and they just like totally shifts perspective, and it just like is this cool thing dropped right in the middle of the book. So I was like trying to do that.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, I am not Colson Whitehead. I'm not 2-time Pulitzer winner Colson Whitehead. and it just like wasn't really working the same way. So I reduced it a lot, but I did like this idea. Like one of the characters, Duncan, I feel like he's kind of a mystery to the reader in many ways up until this point.
Right.
And then I also just kind of think too that like the book is obviously about like the project of America,
Right.
and like what is like more indicative of like all of the U.S.'s problems than like football.
Yeah. And I love that you use it too to get at this idea that like Southeast Asian cultures look at dogs very differently from American culture in a real way.
Oh, totally. Yeah. Sorry. So like the Michael Vick thing, for people who don't know, he was this like pretty incredible quarterback for the Atlanta Falcons, and his career got like really derailed when he was caught like running a like dogfighting thing, like kind of in his like compound or whatever. And like I don't condone dogfighting, but like for all the other things that like NFL players get away with, it's like we like value like the safety of dogs over like the health of like other human beings
or brains
or
like
brains.
anything,
Like it's like crazy to me. Like he went to prison.
Yeah, in some ways I felt like you were using that also to justify to your parents that many hours spent playing Madden in like the early 2000s was all worth it.
I mean, that's the other thing too. It's like I'm just like, ooh, like the NFL is so problematic, and then just like every Sunday I'm just like glued to the couch, like watching my problematic sport.
Yeah, it's so funny because there are these extended portions of your book too where you really like, flex with your football knowledge in a very real way. So I wanted to ask you about your fantasy football league real quick and who the most famous person in it might be.
I don't have any famous people in my own league, but I did hear a funny story once about I had a friend that worked at Random House, and I guess like Random House had its own like fantasy football. This was probably like 20 years ago. So he's telling me a story later. But the author, like they asked the author James Fry if he wanted to join, and he was just like coming off of like A Million Little Pieces.
Right.
And he was like, yeah.
Oprah was so mad, all that stuff.
Oprah was really mad. It was good for the book. And then James Fry like joined the league. He's also like, can my friend join the league? And they're like, yeah, sure, whatever. It's like fantasy football. And after like the first week, like his like friend like traded all his good players to James Fry's team. So like it was obviously just him again.
Oh wow.
And I was just like the audacity to like cheat at fantasy football with like your publisher. I was just like, may we all have that confidence.
Oh man, he has a new book coming out too in about a month. Check it out, I guess.
Just don't invite him to your fantasy football league. Or do, I don't know. Just don't invite his friend.
You wrote this really great piece as an addendum to the book for the New York Times about your dad and your dad going out and interviewing the rest of his family about sort of like their family history and like escaping Vietnam and all that sort of stuff. Can you talk a little bit about how that came up in the first place with your dad and like what made him want to do that for you?
Yeah. It was funny, actually. Like, I was already writing this book, and then my dad like emails me one day, and it's just like a Dropbox folder called like Nguyen, like oral history or family oral history or something like that. And
So he did it himself.
he did himself. My
Wow.
first thought was like, who taught Dad how to use Dropbox? And then two, like, I was like listening to these files, and he had interviewed his siblings about their various lives in Vietnam and their flights from it. My dad was the first to leave. He left actually before the fall of Saigon. He got into school in the U.S., and so he left a little early. So actually, like a lot of what the rest of his siblings experienced, like he had heard about and he knew, but like they never really like sat down and talked about it. So that was sort of his attempt to do that. And his sort of impetus for that was his mother, like my grandmother, had passed like a few years ago, and she had kind of written this like long thing about her life, which was really fascinating. And so he just kind of like, the way he told it to me, he just like wanted to pass more of that down, And it's kind of interesting, like growing up. My parents didn't really talk about the war. Like they left when they were 18, like I guess I came along like 12 years later in their life. So like they were different people by then, but I don't know, like partly, and this is kind of thematically in the book, it's like if you don't know your history, just like, should you seek it out? Probably. but also just like if your parents don't want to talk about it, like that's kind of their right as well. But like, so it's about those gaps. Like, what do you lose in those gaps? And yeah, so then my dad recorded all these interviews with his siblings, and they were like fascinating. Part of what's really funny is that like my dad is like not Terry Gross, you know. He's like, it's just like he's asking these questions, and then like he'll like ask another question, and then he'll like interrupt his like siblings, and then like the chronology gets like really confusing. So it was kind of like listening to like this like fascinating, like very poorly produced podcast. And my dad's like phone is like pinging in the background, and like
and the editor was just like, oh, you should have done it this way, like, you know.
Well, I would just like, it was bad. I would like, you know, I called him up and we talked about it quite a bit. And yeah, there's actually like an earlier version of this book where I put like some of the transcripts of those interviews in the book. Just like more cutting room floor stuff. Because I did like, there's an earlier version that kind of tried to blend a little bit of like fiction and memoir, and that quickly was like not working.
Right.
But yeah, but there's like a lot of that energy in the book of just like, and then the other thing with my dad's recordings is that like it reveals to him and to the listener that like he misremembered a lot of things.
Right.
And that there are certain things he had never really asked his family or his siblings, or things that like they disagreed on in terms of memory. Yeah, and so it's sort of just like what is truth, like when people's memories are different. And I don't know. I thought that was like a really there's no actual direct stuff about it in the book, but I do feel heavily influenced by that project that my dad did, and like you know, to his credit, like he like no one asked him to do that, he just like went and did it.
Yeah. Do you feel in some ways maybe this project of writing the book gave him the permission structure to do this thing he kind of always wanted to do?
Sorry, did his thing give me permission or vice versa?
Or did him knowing that you were writing this book like give him
Oh,
the
he didn't know I
green
was
light
writing
away?
this book.
Oh, really?
Yeah, we don't talk that often. So or no, we talk like a decent amount, but like he just like will text me things, and he's just like, it'll just be like, Djokovic is back. You know? Or it'll just be like about he's like watched everything on HBO.
Yeah.
So
What was like the sort of most surprising thing that he unearthed about your family?
Yeah, I think it was less like the facts of their departure from Vietnam, which it is funny because it's like it was so dramatic. Like, you know, like some people left like with missionaries and were like literally tossed in helicopters. Like a sister was basically like given as a servant, you know. Like 3 of them, including my grandmother, like they set out on like a tiny boat, you know, and like hoping to get picked up by like a vessel and a larger ship, and they did, and that's like, and there were like Malaysian pirates involved. Like it just like the whole thing is so like it's so crazy, you know, and it's scary and it's violent, and it's like the real stuff of like adventure and drama. And I don't know, it's just like I think about my life sometimes, and I'm just like I'll come home and be like, someone called me a slur on the subway, you know. It's like as if it's the same thing, you know. It's like my my life is like so much smaller than that, and I'll just tell that story for like weeks, you know. And, like my family, like they won't talk about like being on the boat.
What sort of like right before you were writing this book, what was your research sort of looking like? Like, were you watching a lot of documentaries? Like, were you reading around like in this area specifically? What did that sort of look like?
Yeah, it's kind of like split up in some ways. There is a lot we haven't really talked about, but like there's a lot of stuff in the book that is like it's basically based on like contemporary like detention of migrants in this country. You know, I did like come across like a Goodreads review that was just like the U.S. does not have capacity to incarcerate like 2 million people. And I'm just like, let me tell you what's already happening, you know, like with regular incarceration, but like ICE detains like 500,000 people a year. Mm-hmm. So it's like millions of people have moved through ICE detention in the past decade. Like this thing is already happening on some level. So even if the concept of like U.S. citizens being detained seems outlandish to you, well, actually that doesn't seem outlandish at all anymore, right? Like, So like that, I was actually editing and writing about at work already. With Japanese-American incarceration, I had been reading about it kind of off and on since college. So that was just like a long-term project without really any, goal in mind that I would ever write about it or put it in a book. And then the actual more deliberate research I was doing was about the Vietnam War. And there are a lot of pretty strong books about the Vietnam War, but like, especially all like the capital W war books, like they're just written like with this kind of strange voice and distance that I found like quite frustrating. And I do think it's like a limitation of the form of like a history book in some ways.
Right.
But yeah, it just like sort of like journalism. I just like I don't have an answer for like how to do a better version of that. But like the book is sort of acknowledging the weirdness of how that is expressed, and like it's like in all history books,
Right. Did you have the concept of using 4 sort of like distinct cousins with like very diverse personalities from the get-go of this book, or did you have a sort of different like set of characters in mind?
No, I always had the 4 cousins in mind. I was kind of influenced a little bit by my family. I lived in New York basically without any family for a long time, and then like I have like a cousin that arrived, then my sister lives here, and they're like probably 8 or 9 years younger than me, and then like a couple other cousins arrived, and their life here in New York was like so much different from mine.
Right.
Because like my 20s was defined by like staying up late and writing like something for the Atlantic for like $200.
Oh yeah.
And like I tell my sister that, and she's like, "Why?" And I'm just like, "That's a really good question. I don't know like why that's like how my 20s looked, you know."
I mean, same. They still owe me a $200 check
Yeah,
from like
that's probably
2012 at this point.
But yeah, like my cousins and my sister, like they just have this like much more like vibrant, outgoing life. I guess I'm just saying they party a lot.
Yeah.
But like all their friends are Asian, and it just seems like they don't have like a care in the world, you know? And I just liked, but also like them in close proximity to each other is like fascinating, because I love the dynamic of family, because it's like these are people that you like truly deeply love, and they're the people that annoy you the most.
Yeah.
You know, and it's just like you can't get away from that, and I like that as a tension in the book. Like there are characters who just like admire each other and love each other, and also like they're so frustrated when like a text is not returned or a text sounds a certain way, and so I like that as a dynamic. And I don't know, I also like writing about like people in their like early 20s.
Yeah, I also love that it allowed you to show a wider spectrum of identity in some ways. Like in some ways, my favorite character was Duncan, who is sort of like the moronic football player that you mentioned earlier. Who is he based off?
No one's based off anyone. My
Come on.
you know, all my cousins are convinced like they're certain characters.
And you just like let that chaos like run
Yeah,
through
like
them.
they're always like arguing that they're like the smart one, you know.
Wow.
I just want to be like, none of you are the smart one. You know?
Which character do you identify with most closely?
I think like an author, you're like in all of them in a way,
Right.
but probably like.
You're a little bit of a jock, a little bit of a journalism nerd, a little bit of a...
Well, I think the other thing too is like, and this is like really true of my first book, but like, I kind of like imagine like a scenario like I might be in, and how I might think of it, and how I might like weigh the decisions, and then I would like when I write a character, I like usually have them make the wrong decision,
Yeah.
or like the more selfish decision, or like honestly narratively the more exciting decision.
Yeah.
Because I'm like a really boring person, and I don't need that in the book. Like, let's have some exciting people in the book. So yeah.
Yeah, let's make some dumb mistakes. Let's like go for it.
Yeah, I think that's like, I don't know. There's just like still this ongoing conversation about like likable characters,
Yeah.
and I don't know. I just think that like flawed characters are so much more fun to read about. Mechanically, they're more interesting in a novel. I don't know. It's like if you want to read about good people, I'm sure there's like a TikTok for that. So.
You know, you've gotten a lot of like really great press from this book. The New York Times gave you a great review. LA Times gave you a great review. But I know like how your mind operates, and you sort of would latch on to like the one critical comment that you would read randomly. Like, what's the one piece of criticism that sticks out to you with this book?
Ooh, that's spicy. Well, it's kind of funny. I sort of mentioned like Goodreads earlier. Like when you become an author, like one piece of advice you get is like don't read your Goodreads reviews. I read all of them, and I actually like find them quite instructive.
Criticism keeps you sharp.
Yeah. Well, partly too, it's like it's also fun doing. My favorite thing about doing book events. Sometimes like interlocutors will be like, "Do you want me to send the questions ahead of time?" And I'm like, no, like I kind of just like want to be surprised on stage, surprised and lightly insulted. And but it's just funny, like Goodreads, like reviewers, they I don't want to like talk about them like in too broad of terms, but like it's just funny seeing the things people latch onto, what they like, but like especially like what they don't like. And like I'll never forget, this was on my first book, but my favorite review, it just starts out and it's just like, I just have to admit it to myself. I don't like literary fiction. Just like, I guess I'm glad that I could like make this person come to that realization. So yeah, I think in terms of criticism for this book, I don't know. I think I hit a few people that didn't like the ending, and I think the ending's really good. So that's like kind of stuck in my head a little bit.
Oh, interesting. Well, not everyone here has read it, so we won't give it away. But
Well, spoiler: the ending's good.
what else was I going to ask you about? Back to writing the book, real quick. What was the first part of it that you actually wrote down?
That's a good question. I'm actually not sure. I also, I will say that one thing I knew I wanted to do was to do short chapters. So like very few chapters are like longer than 1,000 words. And I knew the reason I wanted to do that is I wanted to bounce around between point of view characters. So you'll never get like a chapter with like Ursula's point of view and then the next chapter is Ursula's point of view. Like it's always moving around. And what I really liked is like those gaps create a lot of tension.
Yeah.
And then a lot of the mechanics of the book, this is pretty crafty, but like each character is like kind of making decisions and taking actions that actually like affect other characters inadvertently. So it's sort of like someone does a thing and then you like kind of see the outcome of it that like the other characters can see, but like another character is like experiencing. And so that was really fun. And that was like kind of a hard web to put together. But I'm pretty sure I started like in the middle. I was writing like writing these 1,000-word chapters and I was kind of writing them like in any order, like, cause I just like knew I needed to like, again, like puke it all out. And then when it came down to like revising it, I was like, oh, like I really should have had a stronger outline because like revising was just like a nightmare.
Yeah.
You know?
Did you print out all the different chapters and sort of like Jenga it, or like how did you sort of like do that reorganization?
Yeah, a little bit. I started using this piece of software called Scrivener, which had come like highly recommended. I think it like works for some people. I also want to like the name of the company that makes Scrivener is called Literature and Latte, which is just like maybe the worst name for a company I've ever heard. And it's kind of funny because like the software is hideous. Like it looks like something from like Windows 95. Yeah. It's like lots of like little panes and the information density is like really weird in the age of phones. But it's also like very powerful, and I was able to like set it up so I could like look at all my chapters, and then I color coded each point of view character, and it actually gave me like a really great like visual way to be like, oh, like we don't hear enough from Duncan in this chunk, you know?
Yeah.
So that was really helpful. Yeah, and then partly it was like the pandemic, because like I think otherwise I would have gone to like Staples and bought like index cards, but like you like remember that times like you ordered like something on the internet and then like you got something totally different. So yeah, that was like mechanically like a helpful thing.
Cool. Congratulations on this book. It's phenomenal.
Thanks.
After reading it, my wife, she's probably watching on the live stream right now, like kind of started bawling in bed. And so I was like, oh, that's a really good sign that big year for Vietnamese cultural dominance. I feel like you are leapfrogging the Koreans right now outside of K-pop. So congratulations.
I don't
on
know. We don't have like a
participating in
band yet, so
that. You got Ocean Vong doing a lot of heavy lifting right now, but
that's true. He's on Oprah.
yeah. Cool. Now we got some questions here. Da-na-na-na-na. Cool. This first one. Is the internment camp based on a real place?
Yeah, obviously, like it's based on, mostly it's based on like Manzanar, because there's just like the most literature about that, and in some ways, like the first camp you read about is like the one that stays in your mind.
Yeah.
That's probably a famous saying.
Yeah.
But yeah, so I always imagine it in like a desert environment, just like really spare. But I think it's like I like that image because it's like a desert is like a non-place, right? Like it's flat. That's just like so. It was kind of like nice. It's like you like create a place out of the dust in that sense. But part of the book is like imagining like how that would look today. Mm-hmm. So like a lot of how the camp works are like entirely invented, which was honestly like kind of the fun part. Like just imagining like how would you torture people? How would I torture these like annoying cousin characters in the book? And yeah, like what would you? It's like what would upset them the most? And it's just like, oh yeah, like they can't have their phone anymore.
Yeah. And I love the detail of you like saying that a certain shoe company invented the gyms and stuff on camp as a symbol of like largesse, which was really funny.
Oh yeah, I mean the other thing I thought about too is like if some form of mass detention, incarceration happening in today, it's like even the Republicans would like probably try and sell it a certain way.
Thank you.
And so the way I had it in the book is like they're just like, oh, like it's camp. Like isn't camp fun? Like there's a gym, which like kind of sounds outlandish, or it did when I was writing it, and now I feel like doesn't sound outlandish at all.
Yeah, you really hit the moving target on that one. This question's fun. What did your dad think of HBO's The Sympathizer?
He loved it. The Sympathizer is his favorite book.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
That's a sexy book.
Yeah, that would actually explain a lot of things. No, I actually, the funniest thing is, like, I know Nguyen. He's like just this great champion of like the Vietnamese community, and it's so funny. I was like, so I met him a few years ago, and it was like after The Sympathizer came out, but it was sort of before he had won the Pulitzer, and so yeah, he was just like a guy that wrote like a well-received, super popular book, and so we met because he was assembling some Vietnamese people for coffee. And I just remember like on the way to the hotel I was meeting him at, I was like just trying to find like the address or something. And so I just searched my inbox for Viet. And then I realized that he had actually like emailed me before The Sympathizer came out.
Oh, wow.
And I was reviewing books at the time, and he was just like, he had sent me like a cold email asking me if I like could read and review The Sympathizer. Wow. And I never responded.
You would have been like, eh.
So like, yeah, well, like even after that, he's just like, just a good sport. Like he blurbed my first book. Like, he's been super helpful. And
that's so great. This card has a couple questions on it. All of them are really good. Did you have a different ending in mind at any point?
Yes. Well, I guess not necessarily like plot-wise. I guess I don't want to give too much away, but yeah, like I actually had a few different attempts at an ending that would. It's hard to make a story like this satisfying, I think, as an ending. There's a book I think a lot about, Room by Emma Donoghue, and maybe you've like read the book, seen the movie. It's obviously like about this like woman and her child who are like basically kept locked up in a room by like this menace for many years. So it's a really dark book, and like halfway through the book, like they escape. Escape's really exciting, and then like the back half of the book, which is like 50% of the book, is like just about how like getting out of the room did like not solve all the things that she and her son were feeling. And I remember reading a lot, and like that's like the point of the book. Like if you think the point of the book is like the dramatic escape, it's like you've really missed the point. Although it's really well written in that way, but But yeah, like people are just like, oh, like the ending's such a bummer, you know? And it's just like, yeah, it's like it's about trauma, and I think it's like kind of on its face. But I also like kind of understand where those readers are coming from. So I did want to find something that felt honest about like what happens after camp, but then like trying to land it on like a note that's not like too bleak, you know? And so I don't know. I personally like, of all the things in the book, like the ending is one of the things like I'm personally proudest of. So I feel pretty good about where it landed.
In the book, there are different definitions of, quote, survival. After writing the book, what is your definition?
Ooh, that's a good question. Yeah, there's like a running motif in the book about how selfish you have to be to survive something. And I don't know. I think there are certain characters that believe you have to be like very selfish. I think on some level, on different skills, we're all trying to survive day to day. That's like just what living is. I guess if I have a personal definition, it's just like how selfish can we be while still like being good to the people around us? But that's like a very boring answer. So that's not how any of the characters in this book would answer.
This is a good question. Can you talk a little bit about when a character has really come alive for you while writing them from when they were just an idea?
Yeah, actually, Duncan, the character that plays football, was one that really came alive when I was like writing the football scenes. I pulled like a lot of inspiration, like there's this like pretty like middle of the road Don DeLillo book called End Zone, and there's just it's very DeLillo, like it just like parallels like the fear of like like nuclear apocalypse with like the end game of like touchdown, like football stuff. And it doesn't totally work, but like in the middle of this book, there's just like this great prolonged like football scene. It's probably like 16 pages, and it's just like totally gripping. It's totally thrilling. It makes the whole book worth it. And so I was like thinking a lot about that and like how I could put some of that energy in the book. So like, yeah, it's just fun to write action scenes. It's fun to write scenes where characters are like quite literally activated. Kind of in the. It's so funny. Like the first thing you're taught is like show don't tell, which is like not like a rule, but it was like probably the purest distillation of like showing. It's like this guy's going to be violent on a football field.
Yeah. I love that he was like so good at tackling people. That was like a
linebacker. Yeah.
How did your politics or connection to the Vietnamese diasporic identity evolve as you wrote this book? If at all.
Yeah, I was going to say, how did my politics about the Vietnamese diaspora evolve as I wrote the book? Yeah, I don't know if they did. I think the politics of mine that kind of evolved as I wrote the book is, it's kind of funny to be talking about this book during AAPI month, because the book kind of questions like how strong the solidarity among Asian Americans is.
Yes.
It's a big tent, I know sometimes it feels small because we represent like 6% of the United States population, but you live in a place like New York City, and there's a lot of us, kind of nice. But it's interesting how we're just like, because like, well, there's obviously so much diversity within what we deem AAPI. Like obviously, it's like our languages are different, our cultures are different, our food's different. I think we like kind of don't look alike either. There's also, I feel like, there's like a huge divide between like East Asians and Southeast Asians and South Asians. And we kind of like, we're all under the big tent for the sake of solidarity, which makes sense. It's useful and it's helpful, but I don't know. Like there are also, we always cut things that way. And like, what do we actually all have in common? What are we like actually all trying to achieve? Will our communities be there for each other? I think the other thing too about the way we've organized like the big tent of AAPI is like there's a way to organize it that's like along like ways of immigration that actually I think feels closer to like a lived experience.
Right.
But yeah, like if you're just like a recent like Filipino immigrant, or like a 5th generation Japanese American, it's like you're supposed to supposedly like have a lot of things in common.
Yeah.
You know? So the book is like, I wouldn't say critical, but it like certainly is just asking a lot of questions.
Right. Well, the thing they have in common is LNL, Hawaiian barbecue. But can you talk a little bit about the choice to name one of your characters Ursula, and is that name supposed to signal that she's a villain?
Yeah, it's funny because I think there's a joke in the book about whether she's like named after Ursula, the villain from The Little Mermaid, or if she's like named after Ursula K. Le Guin. Mostly, there's kind of a thing. I think so. The book is about Vietnamese people, and I say this as like a victim of this, but like a lot of like Vietnamese parents give their kids like very typically Anglo names. Like Kevin Nguyen is like a meme. You guys know this meme?
Have you guys heard of it?
Okay, so there.
Okay.
Oh, cool. This is my dream, to explain a meme on a stage. It's
Yeah,
gonna
break
be
it down.
so funny when you explain a joke
Start
on the
the
internet.
PowerPoint
I know,
right now.
No, so it's this. Well, I've obviously been Kevin Nguyen forever. It's not a pen name, but like in the past like 6 years, there's this kind of meme that is like, it's mostly among Gen Z Vietnamese kids from like Southern California.
Yeah.
But the thing is, the thing that has carried on is like, for some reason, like there's this trend of Vietnamese people like naming their kids like Andrew, Kevin, Brian, Tina, you know, like just super easy like Anglo names. Like you probably get called something else at home, you
Right.
know? But yeah, so there's this meme where it's like you shout Kevin Nguyen in a club, and then everyone turns around and it's just like a bunch of like bros, like Vietnamese bros.
Often shirtless.
Yeah, often shirtless.
Wearing raver beads.
And this is really fun. And I love this meme because it's like so regionally specific. You know, it's like not just like a group of people, it's not just a place, but it's like a generation of bros. I don't know. And it's obviously in jest, but what's super funny is like, I would say that I do not resemble this meme at all. Yeah. And I'm like the most famous Kevin Nguyen. And there's like, you know, just like, this guy likes literary fiction. He likes to stay up late writing something for The Atlantic for $200, you know? So, I don't know. I think it's like tremendously funny. There are like TikToks about how I don't look like a Kevin Nguyen,
Yeah.
which I also love. What was the question?
Is Ursula
my-
supposed to be a villain?
Oh yeah. The question was, what are your favorite memes? No, and so in some contrast, there's Jen, and Jen is like a pretty common name for Vietnamese people. And then like I kind of wanted like someone to be named something like kind of wild, like Ursula, and she's. Yeah, I kind of wanted to illustrate sort of like the differences between them that way. But I think I also just like the name Ursula.
Yeah. One of Kevin's best ideas for a story that he still has to do for me at some point is to track down the other Kevin Nguyen's on the first page of Google results and interview all of them. And it's
True. All the raver bros, which is actually funny because I bet if I look them all up, they're not like that at all.
They're all doctors. And
They're all
people
bright
like
doctors. There is actually like a famous Kevin Nguyen who's like he's like a Paralympic sharpshooter, which is like cool as hell. And I did start looking into this. It looks like I'm like trying to look up myself, and I'm just like, I'm seeing photos of myself. I'm just like, get out of here. Show me someone more interesting.
That's so funny. You just got to get shredded before you go like meet them, you know?
Yeah, that's true.
Cool. I think that's it for all our questions.
Thanks for doing this,
cool.
Chris.
Yeah, thank you. Love you, buddy.
Love you too.
It was fun.